Good evening. We are live. Welcome to our the Work of Christmas webinar, everybody. I know I think we had like a great turnout for registrations. I think we had close to 80 people registered who wanted to listen. And I know whenever we do these things kind of live, we'll get a lot less than that, but people will come back and listen. So it is good to see everybody. We'll give you a minute here to jump on. Hopefully you're having we're in like, what, is this the 5th day of Christmas?
Let's count.
Are we in day I always lose track of which day. Like I knew earlier today.
5th day, yeah.
5th day, yeah, we're in day 5 of Christmas. So want to welcome everybody to this great webinar that we've got as part of our 12 Days of Christmas series here at Crossroads. We're working through this little book by Dr. Bruce Epperly, and we're doing the daily readings together, celebrating. On Sunday, Pastor Dennis gave a wonderful message just talking about beauty in Christmas, which was kind of part of the day 3 reading. And so we are super excited to have this time together this evening. So thank you, everybody, for joining in and being a part of it. And I'm gonna click on, we're in this new webinar feature. So I'm just trying to look and see if I can see who is in the room. But we also want you to know, yeah, there you all are. So we got Ann and Kate, Aisha's jumping on, Kat, Connor, they're in Massachusetts. We're talking with Dr. Bruce Epperly, who's in your neck of the woods.
Cape Cod.
Greg, yeah, right there in Cape Cod is where you are. He's in he's in Connecticut, actually. Yeah, he's in Connecticut. So
it's a small world out there.
It is. It definitely is. So thanks, everybody, for joining us live. Listen, hey, if you have a question for Dr. Epperly as we're going through, I just want to make sure you know, if you use the chat feature, you can throw a question up in there, and we'll be monitoring it and looking for it. And if you are so brave, we might even try the speak feature. If you've got a microphone, you can click on the little speak feature, which will raise your hand, and we'll see that request and bring you on, which is kind of scary to not see the question ahead of time. But so we're super excited to be together here with Dr. Bruce Epperly. Dr. Epperly is a nationally known pastor, educator, and author. Served for 40 years as a congregational pastor and is currently at South Congregational United Church of Christ in Centerville, Massachusetts, which is near the Cape. Dr. Epperly has been university chaplain, professor, seminary administrator, written over 50 books. Did I read that right? 50 books?
Well, some people write everything they think. And some things I don't think.
I love it. Well, you have written over 50 books on practical theology, ministry, spirituality, including the award-winning Tending to the Holy, the Practice of the Presence of God in Ministry. Dr. Bruce Epperly, thank you so much for being a part of this. Tell us a little bit about your faith journey as a whole, just where you've come and gone and your introduction to faith and where you are right now, if you wouldn't mind. And tell us a little bit about your family, too.
Okay, well, that's a wonderful question. Of course, it's one of the most revealing questions as to how do you describe a life? How do you describe the life you have? And it changes every time somebody asks me this question. Of course, you have the stock questions that are facts and where I came from and where I think I might be going. But I'll give a little bit of that. I'm a native Californian who found myself out in Cape Cod. I grew up in the Salinas Valley in Steinbeck country, and my father was the pastor of the Baptist Church in King City, California. So if you're driving up 101 from Los Angeles to San Francisco, you go to it. You can get some of the best burritos anywhere in the country there. It's a great place. I grew up in the manse, in the parsonage. I was a very pious child. I came forward at a revival meeting. It's a rather humorous story. Baptists need to be revived on a regular basis, so we had many revival meetings. But it was the Leonard Eilers revival, the Roundup for God. So it was this cowboy evangelist who made his life ministering to the cowboys in the movies. And he came up to King City one summer, and maybe it was a rite of passage for us Baptists. At about 9 or 10, we'd come forward in a revival. But it was the Roundup for God. Put your foot in the stirrup, climb up on the horse. The Roundup for God is on. And so I came up and felt that Jesus had touched me. It became really, it was truly a culmination. As a child, I was somewhat of a mystic. We moved to the big city a couple years later, to San Jose, and my life became much less oriented toward the church. Perhaps it was the teenage years. Perhaps it was growing up in the summer of love. Perhaps it was the fact that the religion I grew up with, while it was important, I'd never ever deny where I came from, no longer suited my needs. It's interesting because I was very much part of the scene in San Francisco during the high school and early college. And yet at one point in time, I decided that scene was insufficient for me. And I came back to faith, oddly enough. It's an odd conversion story, or a reconversion story, by learning transcendental meditation in my freshman year in college at an ashram a couple blocks away from UC Berkeley. And then 2 weeks later, started going to church again at the Grace Baptist Church. The pastor and the college minister both saw something in me, and once they saw in me both a pastor and a teacher. And so I was sort of a scruffy, long-haired kid with a beard 6 inches longer than it is now. I probably looked a little bit like somebody on Alabama or Leonard Skinner. And they saw me as a teacher and a pastor, and kind of gave me opportunities to learn that took me to graduate school in Southern California at Claremont, and seminary in Southern California. And then over the past 40 years, we kind of worked our way across the country. My wife and I are celebrating our 42nd anniversary. It's hard to believe we've been married that long, or frankly, that we're that old. I joke with people that I'm really in midlife, provided I live to be 136. And so we spent a year in Tucson and had our only child born in 1980 there in Tucson, and then moved taught at Michigan, and then went to Georgetown to be university chaplain for Protestants at Georgetown University for about 20 years, and taught theology and medicine there. And actually, one of my small claims to fame was being one of the first persons ever to teach a course on spirituality at a medical school. Then ended up helping to run a seminary in D.C., Wesley Theological Seminary, working for the president there and being on one of the deans there, then as associate dean, and then moving to Lancaster Seminary to help run that seminary in terms of its outreach. And finally, about the age of 60, my desire to be a president of a seminary never came to fruition, and I felt the call back to congregational ministry. And so I end up here on Cape Cod, out near the Nantucket Sound, at a historic church, 225 years old this year, a church that looks on a bluff above the Nantucket Sound. I'm an inveterate walker, so I walk on the beach about 350 days of the year. There's 2 or 3 days where it's just too darn cold, or it's icy enough that I can't get out of my driveway. And, it's almost like clockwork. I think some of my congregants, and it's not a large church. I chose a small church rather than a large church because I wanted to continue to write and teach. Some of my congregants drive by just to wave at me during this COVID time. And we're not meeting each other. We're not doing in-person worship, but they can wave, and we chat sometimes with our masks on from 8 feet distance with the wind whipping through. After we moved up to Cape Cod 8 years ago, we're very close to our son and his family. They moved up to the next village on Cape Cod. And so we spend a good deal of time with our grandchildren, who are 8 and 10. And that's become a real calling to me as well. I think my wife and I see ourselves as seeing the role of grandparents as sort of what we refer to now as good ancestors, that we're trying to build it for not only for our own children, but for children everywhere, that they live in a better world and that they have a world that is clean and beautiful, and the issues of race are those that they don't have to contend with, and that there be really truly a just world of shalom.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for that introduction for yourself. Before you answer your next question, Bruce, would you do me a favor? I think maybe your microphone got bumped a little bit. If you move it a little towards your mouth, that might help us.
Sure.
It's on your right earpiece, I believe.
Oh,
Ended up getting a little tiny. So that would be a little helpful if that'll bend towards.
Is that better for you?
That is, yeah, that's awesome.
I hope I wasn't the only one talking to myself, and I hope you heard me.
Fine. We heard you fine. We heard you fine. So, hey, let's jump in. We're working through one of your 50 books, which it sounds like we could work through.
There have probably been a couple more boards since that time. You know, it's a COVID era, and there's not much to do during this other than read and play with your grandchildren.
So I had this crazy idea. It was around this time last year, or actually it was in December, and I thought, what if we really leaned into the 12 Days of Christmas? And so I just began kind of scouring for 12 Days of Christmas resources and came across, you actually have 2 or 3 of these 12 Days of Christmas books.
Yeah.
But we decided to do the work of Christmas because we're on this journey as a church really into peacemaking, where we feel like God is guiding and directing us into understanding our Christian spirituality in terms of peacemaking and shalom and wholeness, and really understanding salvation as this idea of participation, right? Of being invited into participation, not being saved from God, not being saved from hell, but understanding this idea that we are saved from wounding one another. We are saved from that effect of sin and having been influenced by a lot of spirituality in that. So we're working through this book, The Work of Christmas, the 12 Days with Howard Thurman. Now, I would love to hear, tell us a little bit about how you came to begin exploring the work of Howard Thurman, and maybe for those of us that aren't super familiar with his life, give us a quick primer on his life and his work, and then we'll jump into some things that have really impacted you about his teachings and life. But how did you begin exploring Howard Thurman, and what is the significance of his life and work?
Well, it came actually early on in my return to being part of a Christian community. The Baptist College chaplain, Shorty Collins, who was 6'7", had retired by that time. I think he was born in the late 19th century, and was a contemporary of Thurman's. They got to know each other in the 1920s. That sounds like a whole world away. They were part of a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. The Fellowship of Reconciliation. It still exists. It was one of the first peace groups out there. And Howard Thurman and Shorty, an African-American man and a white man, became good friends. And Howard Thurman had retired to San Francisco in the late 1960s, early 70s. And he had him come down to speak at the church and give a little lecture. And I really became enamored of the person he was. He was a quiet, contemplative person, and yet he had a fire. He was a slow and deliberate speaker. There's a documentary on him by PBS, and you can see the documentary and see what a deliberate speaker, very soft-spoken, almost of another era. But he was a contemplative. He was influenced people like Martin Luther King. King carried his book, Jesus and the Dispossessed, probably the first African-American liberation theology written in the 1940s, with him in the height of the civil rights movement. And it's appropriate that when you talk about peacemaking and being a peace or a justice church, that Thurman is the right person for the time. He was raised in Jim Crow. He was raised in separate but equal. He was raised where the white folks could go on his side of town, but it was pretty tough for the black folks to go on the other side of town. He was raised with the threat of violence, fairly low to the ground, very economic struggles in his life. But through what he would call providence or the movements of God, he found his way into Morehouse College and then Divinity School up at in New York at Crosley, Rochester. I have trouble with the name right now. He ended up being a professor at Morehouse, then later on dean of the Rankin Chapel at Howard University, one of the great historical Black universities. Then went to Boston, eventually to be the dean of chapel there, the first African American person to hold the deanship at a primarily white institution. Mm. Along the way, and I think actually before he went to Boston University, he founded, was asked to be founding pastor with a white fellow of the first intentionally interracial church, the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco. He was a writer, a poet, an artist. He was known for his meditations. You can hear them, I think, on the website of the Marsh Chapel at Boston University, where he was chaplain or dean of chapel for many years. And I think his influence on me was the influence of how to be politically active without polarizing, how to be involved in changing people's lives. I'm losing my energy, so I need to plug this in. How to be involved in changing people's lives with and protesting and challenging injustice, while at the same time discovering the divinity in those whom you oppose.
Yeah, that's it's interesting you say that. I'm just gonna kind of jump here. Your book, you have another book called Prophetic Healing.
Yes.
Which the subtitle is Howard Thurman's Vision of Contemplative Activism, which is such an interesting phrase because I've been, especially over the last 5 years, really heavily influenced by the writings of Richard Rohr and
yes,
contemplation. I've really valued him. But I love, one of the things I loved about one of the things you said in Prophetic Healing, you said, God is present in the least of these as well as those who seek to perpetuate injustice and violence to maintain their place in the social order. And that was a huge part of Thurman's reality, is like, yes, God is in even the perpetrator of injustice, and how we interact, respond, think about is of vital importance, because if we don't recognize that divine image in all of us, we do what is happening all around us, right? The polarization of everybody. And I super convicted in my life, because I think about, like, I can have so much empathy and forgiveness and grace for the person that, the church world might call this great sinner, or
yes,
the person who's down and out. But if I'm supposed to have that towards, like, a person who I find, like, deeply offensive in their racist attitude or economic injustice, like, I have to remind myself, like, I have to have that like Jesus would tell me to have that same empathy towards the pain, the hurt that's caused them to perpetuate injustice as well, the same lie that's under it. So I think it's fascinating that you bring that up, because it is such an interesting thing, and it's so hard to find that soft edge towards the enemy almost.
And in some ways, it is a persistent soft edge. And in a group of lectures on mysticism and social justice, Thurman says that the mystic who has experienced the divine as their ultimate reality and has had a living experience of God has the obligation to challenge whatever stands in the way of that. And has a challenge not just for the people who are downtrodden, but for those who are oppressors. I mean, I think that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the man or the persons who build their house on the rock and on the sand, or the rich man who builds a great barn and dies that night. The souls of the ones who have are also at stake.
Yeah.
The soul, and I'm here not necessarily talking about heaven and hell, but the soul of their relationship to God, their sense of wholeness, relationship with their families, it's also at stake. And we can be part of a redemptive process of getting beyond the binary. Now, I have trouble with this too, frankly. I try to only listen to cable news at a 5-minute or 10-minute increments. And I'll be honest, my stations are CNN and MSNBC. Those are the stations I watch. And we know the villains on those stations and the heroes on that station. And it's easy to succumb to the same polarization that you see in those you oppose,
Yeah.
that there's no good in them. I'm a fan of Star Wars, and of course, we know that there's even some good in Darth Vader.
Hmm.
And we know that somehow that Baby Yoda is going to be saved on The Mandalorian. That Grogu is going to be saved. I watch this with my grandchildren. They're my teachers nowadays.
I love it. So one big takeaway, just even as I've started to explore Thurman in his life, is that, for me, just that constant reminder of Christ in all, and and
Yes.
and and looking for Christ in all, and recognizing that really I can make sense of the gift of faith, meaning like a person who isn't living in the Christ image that's in them already is still deserving of love and deserving of empathy and understanding. That's one big thing that I think seems to have shaped you. Your writings is shaping my understanding of God. What maybe are another one or two teachings, modes of thinking about, spirituality and God that shaped you from Thurman's teachings that should also maybe shape our lives?
Well, I think the whole notion that God is present in the non human world.
Mm,
Thurman talks about having this mystical relationship as a child he grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida, with a tree in his backyard. And he
mhm,
felt like the tree was almost one with him. I
mm,
think oftentimes, I remember from my days as a university chaplain at Georgetown, occasionally I'd encounter more evangelical students who would say to me, "Well, I can't meditate. That jumps over Jesus, doesn't it, to meditate? I have to go straight to the Word." And of course, I never disabused them of that belief, but I tried to show them that the Word can be mightily working
mm.
in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Uh, that we can have experiences of Jesus and have a personal relationship with Jesus, and not necessarily be that stereotypical Christian.
Mm,
We could be that Christian who meditates, who prays and protests,
mm,
who uh, goes out into the soup kitchens and then calls their congressperson, uh, who who wants not only that person in front of them on the streets of Loveland, Colorado, or Hyannis, Massachusetts, right next to where we live. We're in the shadow of the Kennedy compound, is around across the bay from where I walk. Uh, we can love that individual person and also want to change a world such that that individual person won't have to be homeless. So
mm,
our society, again, and that comes out in the Christmas stories. I, I I think the Christmas stories are intensely political without being partisan. They're
mm,
intensely political without being ideological. I mean, Jesus is. And I learned this from Thurman. It's amazing. I don't know your experience of reading the scripture, where every so often you'll read something, you'll say, I didn't know that. And
yeah.
you've read it for 50 times. And you finally get it. Well, and reading Jesus and the Dispossessed, and here it says maybe it was 15 or 20 years ago, but I've been in ministry for by 30 years, 25 years by then. He made a comment in the book, Thurman: Jesus never lived a moment of his life as a free person.
Mm,
And if you look at the gospel stories of the birth of Jesus, uh, Joseph doesn't want to go to Bethlehem. He has to go to Bethlehem
mm,
to get ready to pay his taxes, to support the stormtroopers, to support the building projects, to support the oppressor. And
mm,
then all of a sudden, in the wake of the Magi's visit, Jesus and his family are political refugees. They're like some of the folks coming up from Central America. And
mm.
while the story of Jesus, the flight to Egypt, doesn't necessarily give us a political policy, it doesn't necessarily tell us how we should respond to undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers. It tells us that our first response should be, how can we help you?
Yeah. We were at a we were watching, you couldn't go to, we were watching the Evolving Faith Conference this year, and there was a wonderful woman who was speaking, and she's pastoring in, I believe it was Southern California, and she made a statement that just like it was just this really eye-opening thing. And just speaking on this idea of undocumented and immigration, she said, where did we ever get this idea that the world was ours to divide up?
Yes.
Right? Like, where did we ever get this idea that the world was ours to divide up? So fascinating. And as I've been meditating and thinking through your book, The Work of Christmas, I've been in a fresh way really impressed that this story of Jesus is far more political than what I ever was raised with. That even
Yes.
the continued martyrdom of Christians around this idea Jesus is Lord had very little to do with the divinity of Jesus, but had everything to do with where allegiance was going to lie in terms of values and decisions and politics and policies. But we have spiritualized it and turned it into this divine statement when really it was such an earthly statement at the
Yes.
time,
Yes.
right? And so much work of not participating in oppressive systems was really this incredible gospel message of liberation that so many of my faith church, my background, like, we missed that was just missed.
Well, I think that you used the term holistic, I believe, earlier on in our conversation. And salvation, I think, has to be understood as whole person. It has to be understood as my relationship with God, my relationship with Jesus. I think we all need to have, within the Christian family, we come to God through Jesus. I certainly have a personal relationship with God through Christ. That doesn't nullify other people's faiths. I'm fully in agreement with Richard Rohr, and I'm always pleased when he quotes me in one of his meditations. I figure I've really made it. That somebody really important has quoted me. But we I pray to, my prayers always end in Jesus' name, the way I learned it when I was a Baptist boy, and that's the way it's going to be. And yet that personal relationship in which we have to come to God as one-on-one at times also says it matters what happens to my neighbor.
Yeah.
It matters. And I think one of the challenges of our time is how to be appropriately involved. And this was probably a challenge obviously for Thurman. He was more countercultural because African Americans didn't have power. But how you can be a Christian and feel a little distant, a spiritual and a political distance, if you want to use that language, from whoever the leader is. I think it's always dangerous to baptize any political leader, most especially the ones that you approve of, as being God's chosen.
Come on.
That, they're all fallible.
Yeah.
And that loyalty, it is good when a politician is faithful, and it's good when a politician goes to church regularly and commits their faith. I certainly am delighted to have an active Christian coming into the White House, and Joe Biden, who attends Mass pretty regularly and quotes the Bible. But that doesn't mean I have to have any adulation for him.
Yeah.
I may, in fact, be more critical of the people that I find resonate with me, because we all can do more.
Yeah. I think part of being involved with means especially in a faith perspective, is to be in a healthy way critical and have those eyes, right? I mean, that's one of the seemingly unique features of our Christian scriptures, particularly the Jewish scriptures, is they kept it in there. They kept the critique in there. You are not going to find that in a lot of other faith traditions. Like, we're keeping the critique of ourselves and our leaders to show our failures. Like, that was a huge part of it.
And that's something that often, I think, especially I'd say 19th, 20th century, 21st century American Christianity has at many times lost that prophetic voice of the Hebraic prophets, of Amos and Hosea, of Isaiah, of Jeremiah, of Micah. They've lost that edge. And if you ask some born-again Christians, they don't even know those books exist. Their understanding of God comes through Luther. Luther's understanding of Paul, which isn't the only understanding of Paul.
Yeah.
And it also neglects James, who serves as kind of a happy complement to Paul,
Yeah.
that show me your work, show me what you're going to do. I think that the challenge is to be involved, but do it prayerfully. I've coined the phrase pray and protest.
Mm.
I think protests left to their own devices do create schisms. I
Mm.
think prayerful protests allow us to see something good, something holy in those with whom to whom we challenge. And in so doing, we may still put the heat on them, and we should put the heat on them, but we do it out of love and not out of hatred. And again, the new boss, as the Who would say, here's to the new boss, just like the old boss. That, well, if we use the old methods of schism, we're going to end up with schism when we gain power.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that why is it that we as a nation, let's say, or maybe Western world, and I will speak specifically about Western, like living in particularly here in the United States, that to be critical of the system in which we are in is somehow unpatriotic. Like,
Yeah.
I haven't understood that. Like, there's a couple of these, like this reality. Like, I remember, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it was maybe 2 years ago, I was teaching a message and just talking about the realities of race in America, and just saying it seems like we've come so far where if all of a sudden we just state that there might be a problem in some institution that is seemingly sacred, right? That somehow you're anti-American or you're anti, you know, law or whatever. What do you think is behind that? Like, why have we become such a people that to be critical because you believe in something better, you believe in the possibility of something better, why does that make a person in so many people's eyes unpatriotic or ungrateful? I mean, where do you think that rolls out from?
Well, I think it is probably part of it is the defensiveness of the life that we're leading. If changes would have to occur, we feel as we're going to lose something.
Mm.
Uh, you know, the uplifting of persons of color is not going to make the life of white people any worse.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in fact, of the matter is the raising of economics for the lower middle class and middle class improves everybody's economics. That's just patently true. I think the other is a certain sense of allowing the politicians to shape our reality,
Mm.
allowing the political slogan to get in the way of thinking. Americans are a profoundly generous people, but they have stingy politics. A person who'd give you the shirt off his back would sometimes say that the family down the street shouldn't get health care.
Mm.
And I think there's a sense, and you have to ask the question, well, why shouldn't they? Again, Christianity doesn't give you a formula, but it says that every child should have food.
Mm-hmm.
It says that the nations are judged, and I assume when they use the term nations, they're using it in a couple different ways. They're using it in the broad sense of peoples, but you could interpret it in terms of the body politic. Nations are judged by how they treat the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of it also, frankly, is a sense that if we were wrong about this, we have to be wrong about everything.
Mm.
But one of the interesting aspects of Christian faith is that we are saved by grace. We're not saved by having our perfection. And if indeed grace abounds, we know we're imperfect. We know that we've committed sins. And if we've committed sins as persons, we surely do as institutions. And that what do you do if you're a sinner? You try to make an amendment. What do you do if you're a sinner? You try to repent and go the other way. You say, well, this was wrong. I don't know how to change it, but we need to work together to change it. We need to have a bias, I think, for people who suffer.
Yes.
Which, of course, is 100% of us. But some people's suffering is a matter of life and death. That was one of the things I learned in my 20 years as a university chaplain for Protestants at Georgetown, was that some of the kids that were in families that probably spent more on their cars than I did and was making in my salary were just as empty. Were just as empty as the people who were on scholarships. And to realize the brokenness of the powerful, not to excuse them for bad behavior, but to say that there's an emptiness sometimes if you're only known by what you do, or whether the crowd is clapping or you have a political rally of adoring people. If you're only known by that, your life is empty. You have to be known by the spirit within you and by your relationship with God and by the love that you have for others. And I think that's really at the heart of Thurman, because, he grows up in an adverse society. And I think in the book, I make a comment about the president of Howard University, not Howard University, Morehouse University, who refers to the lads in the chapel as gentlemen.
Yeah.
And that sounds like an awful strange thing to change your life when somebody refers to you as gentlemen, but Jesus changed people's lives by the words that he addressed them. I think one of my favorite accounts in Scripture is when Jesus calls the name of Mary in the garden. It's not just, "Hey there, Mary." It's addressing the soul of Mary, that Mary is, in fact, the only person in the universe for Jesus at that moment. And she, "Gentlemen, you matter." And I think that for Thurman, it was the sense of recognizing the value in a society that tries to break you down. Now, that even happens with the messages that come to the children of the wealthy. I know that when I lived in the D.C. area in a pretty nice suburb, that there were a lot of latchkey children of parents who were making seven figures and who got no attention. And because I always took seriously my flexibility as a pastor, as a university chaplain, I ended up coaching. I was a terrible coach, but I was a wonderful shaper of boys. I know some of these boys. They're 25 years, 30 years after I coached them. I still hear from them because I had the time to do it, because I could take 3 afternoons off a week to coach. And sometimes the best we can give to somebody is the fact that we notice them.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of noticing, I wanted to make sure you noticed that Rebecca Poos from Buena Vista is listening in, and I know you have a relationship with the church there in Buena Vista, and we're happy to hopefully be a second relationship in Colorado. But Rebecca says, "Hi, Bruce." So I wanted to make sure.
If you're ever in Buena Vista, visit Rebecca Poos. She's a horsewoman, exemplary pastor, and I just am honored to know her.
Oh, there you go, Rebecca. You and I will have to meet up sometime. I would love to. We have a question here, Bruce. We were talking about prophetic healing, the prophetic voice, and Sharon asks, "Are there prophets today? Are there prophets today?" Just why don't you speak to that?
Well, I think there are, and you might be one yourself. Was it Sarah who asked the question?
Sharon.
Sharon, excuse me, Sharon. You might be one yourself, because a prophet, and I think Walter Brueggemann has a nice way of talking about this. A prophet is somebody who has an alternative way of living and looking at the world that's different. One person that I think is a prophet personally that I pay a lot of attention to is William Barber. William Barber is the sort of mentor of the New Poor People's March. And go look the New Poor People's March, a celebration of Dr. King's march of 50 years ago. He's somebody who speaks truth to power. He's a pastor. He calls them the way he sees them. So I'd take a look at William Barber as somebody who really speaks to me in terms of challenging me. I think, though she's pretty much retired now, Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund. Somebody has to say children matter. Somebody has to say that every child needs to be called by name, that they need to have. I think every fall there's a Children's Sunday. And even in this great country, children are neglected. And she calls out our country, a great country in the world that yet has poor birth survival rates, mortality of children, children with barely enough to eat, with millions of children food insecure right now, and without any digital resources to keep up with their classmates. Those are two people who speak to me. Richard Rohr probably might be called a prophet in his own way, in the sense that he's trying to do something that few can do. Something I try to do. I'm a lesser luminary than him, but he tries to combine the spiritual with the active. That you can be deeply spiritual, what I would say heavenly minded and earthly good. That you can be an activist who has a committed relationship with God, who sees God's presence in the other. The other might not, the other is whoever you have trouble with. The other could be the person in power you have trouble with. I think one of the reasons the Bible says pray for those who are rulers, it doesn't mean to agree with them, but it means that whoever is going to be your ruler is going to be a source of trouble at some time or another.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. We don't ever read it that way, do we? We read it through our lens of like quote unquote benevolent leaders. We don't recognize that the absolute corruption at the time of Jesus of every leader who was on the take, who was oppressive,
Yeah.
like this, and even the idea to obey that person. I mean, at least in my tradition, those passages are taught on so superfluously. It's just almost sad.
And I think it was maybe it was Parker Palmer or someone like that who noted that one of the translations of the obedience is to listen. You can listen to the leaders and then decide whether they have anything to say. And I think we need to pray for the leaders. I think one of the problems of the current political situation now is that people will protest without prayer.
Yeah.
The whole country should be soaking Donald Trump in prayer as he leaves office soon, that he find the healing that he needs. The whole country should be praying for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that they do what's right for the country according to their best lights. And that we protest when they don't.
Yes.
That we say, this is something, and I don't know, if anyone is an honest person, I think they have to say, an honest Christian at least, you have to say that no politician is going, or political system is perfect.
Yeah.
And that those times when you have to say, well, you haven't gone far enough on this point, or you've neglected that point, and stay away from the ideologies that keep us from listening to one another.
Yeah, no, that's good. So speaking of, as we kind of get into this reality of life right now, and as Christians who are, again, this word Christian is such a hard word for me these days. It has been.
You almost hate to use it anymore. It's sad.
I really do. It's sad. But let's say for a person who's trying, so we're actually saying, well, let's just call me a peacemaker because they're children of God. Like that's where we're leaning into as a church.
Yeah.
And we've started to say, what are kind of 5 unacceptable truths that we can spend the next 10 years participating in a redemptive way and a holistic way? And we've talked about things like spiritual disconnectedness. We've talked about illiteracy as a massive issue in the world. We've talked about like fear of the other as being something we want to spend our time understanding, that we have such fear within not only just the Christian community, but at large. We have, the reality of sexism and racism and homophobia and all types of just fear of someone who's different than me, leaning into those things. Help me, what do you think are the top, 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 challenges that face like those who are like the called out ones, right? This idea of I want to be a peacemaker. I want to be a person who promotes wholeness and shalom in this world. And I want to do it not just at Christmas, but throughout the whole year. So what might be those 2 or 3 challenges facing the Christian, the Church of Jesus, peacemakers, as it relates to this ongoing work of Christmas throughout the year in 2021, 2022? What do you think?
Well, I think that one of them that speaks to me, and because I'm part of this system. I'm part of this system. I pay taxes. I earn a good income. I pay attention now that I'm in middle life, again, only 68. I look at my retirement funds, and I'm glad when the funds of the denomination or my private TIA CREF goes up from the. I'm happy about that. So I'm speaking within the system. I think that, so I'm trying to, because I think it's first of all important that we don't separate ourselves from those that we critique. I think simplicity of life. I think simplicity of life has something to do with the complete issue, most of the issues we deal with. Simplicity of life has to deal with the environment. We need to recognize, and it's important that we care for prenatal life. But that seems obvious at one level. But we oftentimes don't see the sin of environmental destruction because it's done white collar, or it's white collar crimes are probably more heinous for people than crimes committed by one person in relationship to another because they involve masses. I think simplicity to save the planet. I mean, I get in an odd way the young girl who is on the autistic spectrum. Greta Thunberg is a prophet. Going back to that, just a 16-year-old girl who's calling out the diplomats and the presidents of the world and say, "Do you want us to have a planet that's livable?" I mean, I think God has a great interest in species. Up here in Cape Cod, we're very sea-oriented. And so it's headline news when a right whale baby dies where we live. It's headline news. It's on the local WCAI, the NPR station. Only 400 of these in the planet. They're beautiful animals. They're beautiful companions. And I think God probably has as great an interest in their survival as he does in a particular human being right now. God wants species to survive. Yeah. With simplicity comes, I think, greed, and with greed comes economic inequality. I think that to me, the question of economics is key, and of course, economics and ecology are connected. People talk about eco-justice because in this COVID time, for example, there are, I think, 4.5 more times cases of COVID percentage-wise and deaths among persons of color and persons on reservations. And most of that has to do with economics and where you live.
Yeah.
And I think those are issues that would have been near to Howard Thurman's heart. Howard Thurman, in one of his writings, says that one of the greatest evils of poverty for children is it stifles their imagination. They don't get the sort of ability to just be a child, the ability to let their minds roam across the universe, to be LeBron James, to be Serena Williams, to be the Mandalorian, to be Luke Skywalker, to be Thor, or as at least my grandchildren love the Avengers. They don't get the chance to do that or to imagine other worlds. And I think that Jesus, as a parable teller, invites us to be imaginative people. So I'd say greed, simplicity, economics, environment are all connected. And they're all connected with salvation, interestingly enough, understood broadly speaking. I think Jesus would definitely say, as a child of the prophets, that if you're following God, you get your economic life together. You know, you don't need $1 billion. I do quite fine with a couple million myself. You know, so most people can survive on a couple $1 million. Do people need this? I think Mahatma Gandhi said there is enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And I think that's true. And one of the things that this pandemic has shown us, and if we only paid attention to our words, we'd be okay. Early on in the pandemic, and I haven't heard this as much lately, people would say, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
We're all in this together. We are all. That means I am my sister's keeper. I am my sibling's keeper. We also heard about gratitude. And gratitude for first responders and essential workers, many of which are on, and I must say this is a soapbox for me, but I'm speaking of as Thurman would be, the people who get food on my table, a good many of them are undocumented. A good many of the essential workers are making less than $15 an hour and putting their life at risk so I can do an interview at home.
Yeah.
And get groceries delivered to my house. And I have to translate my gratitude into action. I have to translate it into action to change the world. I mean, the pandemic has been very significant to me, and being a theologian, you know, I began to think about it, and I will plug 2 books that are worth reading. I hope 2 or 3 of mine are. I wrote, believe it or not, the first book by a Christian on the pandemic, Faith in a Time of Pandemic. It was written, came out right after Easter. I saw there was an issue. I wrote a book in 2 weeks. It's just a small book, 50 pages. And prematurely, because probably because I was in a race with N.T. Wright, and I knew he was writing a book, and I think mine is actually a better book than his. Hope Beyond Pandemic. Because the pandemic has revealed, to me at least, some of the diseases of our nation, of poverty, of racism, of eco-injustice, of the sense that some get and some aren't considered. And I think as a Christian, around Christmas, I have to make Christmas. There used to be that saying, let's make Christmas all year round. Well, people didn't know, and that was one of the inspirations of these books, actually, because like a lot of ministers and a lot of parents and grandparents, you know, it got to be Christmas Day. We unwrapped the packages. We had a big dinner. We took a nap. That's that. Christmas is over. And I realized that Christmas has to be a season, and that the 12 days of Christmas are just basically the front door to a year full of Christmas. To me, the incarnation is the foundation of the cross and the resurrection. You can't have a cross and resurrection without an incarnation. And that the cross and resurrection are a way of looking at how much God loves this world, how much God is willing to suffer with us for the world. God loved us before the cross. The cross didn't change anything as far as God was concerned, as far as I'm concerned. But the cross changed our ability to hold on to God and know that we are in God's care. And the resurrection, I think, embodied the body, saying that God's salvation is for all of us and all of us. Body, mind, spirit relationships.
Oh, that's good. No,
I'm a bit of a Baptist, so I'm starting to preach now.
You're going to do it. There you go. I love it. So we've got a few minutes left. If anybody has a question, feel free to put that in the comment section. I had a question kind of to me that was kind of a concern and a thought. I'm going to see if I can encapsulate it and give me your thoughts. And then I want to wrap up with, Bruce, if you'll give us a couple of resources for people that want to continue exploring Howard Thurman's teachings. But so this is a question that came that basically is saying as we as we put on the lens of being a peacemaker as a person of faith, that this really is not an invitation out of the world, but an invitation into the world. We talk about that a lot, that the real heart of Jesus was actually was perhaps, historically we can look and question whether or not Jesus was this apocalyptic prophet who was talking about an actual end of the world, or whether we understand Jesus talking about a whole, yes, there is an end of a world, an
Yes.
entrance into a new world and into the work of creating that new world for others, right? And so if that's the lens with which we think about our Christianity and our faith, what do we do? And this is a really interesting question about, she says, has a struggle with navigating how to gently challenge other believers who are utilizing Christian ideology in a way that might really be the opposite of peacemaking, but actually might be promoting more polarization. And how to do that, obviously speaking through actions is one way, but she's wondering if there's like maybe some help with effective language to it as well. And how do we have good language that honors faith of others, but when we see that faith that is promoting more polarization than peace, like, what do you think? Can you think of any language questions to explore that would maybe help this person out?
Well, yeah, and I think that's a question we all deal with, and I appreciate and applaud her thoughtfulness there, because she's trying to stay in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
She's trying to stay in relationship. I think with the person in our family and the person in our neighborhood, uh, I think our best response is simply to be the Christian that we are, to let our lives speak, and to be a person of integrity, and who out of that integrity can then say, and going back to that old Charles Sheldon book that became popular as a slogan 25 years ago, what would Jesus be doing in this situation?
Yeah.
What would Jesus? I mean, this came back to me. I'm a grandparent, so and you may know or may be the parent of children. How would Jesus treat toddlers on the borderland?
Mm.
That doesn't give you government policy, but it tells you the things you ought not to do.
Yeah.
It tells you that Jesus wouldn't separate a child from their parents.
Mm-hmm.
It tells you that Jesus loves the little children. He put his hands on them on his knee and he blessed them. And I think you could say, well, does that square with the Sermon on the Mount? Or how would you, without being a proof texter, that doesn't always work, but maybe be engaged in saying, well, what do you think of these words from Luke 4:18-19, where Jesus is quoting Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to release the captives, and that sort of thing. Or Mary's Magnificat. Boy, I tell you, that won't go over in most circles. It certainly isn't something we put on the label on Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
It's what do those words mean, and how can I live them out?
Yeah.
And I think one of the important things is that I think people are transformed by relationships. I think I succumb to this. I must say I succumb to this in trying to be right. I try to be right all the time. And occasionally get involved in Facebook conversations. And I don't think I've ever converted anyone yet on Facebook.
I know.
I've just felt the satisfaction of being right and
Yeah.
knowing they're wrong, which
Yeah.
of course in itself is a problem. But I think relationships, so that your life speaks, your integrity speaks to them. And I think that's the key thing. And then share, do you know these people? Have you ever met one? Have you ever met a Muslim? Do you know how it feels to be an African American stopped by a cop? Did you have to talk to your teenager about how to behave around police? Those are things that raise the consciousness of people who assume the world looks like them and acts like them.
Yeah. One thing that I've been asked by some folks in our circles is just like, what did produce even transformation in my own life and my own way of understanding of God? And in those questions, like, I just think about what you said is relationships. Like, I encountered the other in a really intimate way in a lot of areas, and then all of a sudden, like, categories just go out the window.
Oh yeah.
And one thing too I've learned, Bruce, is I've been on this own kind of upending journey of really God reshaping my heart and and opening my imagination to spirituality and life in Christ and Christ in all things is there's nothing that anyone could do or say to prepare my heart for that transformation. It is a work of the Spirit. It is a
Yes.
salvation. And one
Amen.
thing I've tried to help our congregation and people is to recognize, like, you can't prepare someone for a salvation moment or a transformative moment. That is the work of the Spirit in their life. And so to kind of give yourself permission to not change people, but to be present with people. And as God starts to shift hearts and lives, then it's amazing what will happen. But that comes in God's timing, right?
Well, yes, I think so. We can be vehicles of grace, but we have to be humble about it.
Okay, so one more question, and then a recommended resource, and then we're going to go. We got less than a minute now. I'm over, but we're both pastors, so if we end even just 3 minutes late, that's still really good.
Well,
So
yeah.
here's the question. Dr. Epperly, what is the one most important message you hope we all hear from you tonight? I've gotten many things, but always interested in asking a thinker like you for the one most important message for our group tonight.
I think it's a simple message that God is with you and
Mm,
that God accepts you the way you are, but doesn't leave you there.
mm,
I think that God is in the people we love and the people we hate,
mm.
and that God is in the present in us, and God wants us to pray with our hands and feet and hearts. What is it? Teresa of Avila said, "We are God's hands and feet," and that Christmas really says that the incarnation is everywhere,
Mm.
and it's housed in Bethlehem. But when the Word is made flesh, it's all flesh. All flesh shall see God's glory.
Oh, that's good. Okay, give us a couple resources to continue exploring Howard Thurman. What would you have for us? I'm going to plug
Well,
your book, Prophetic Healing, so you don't have to.
okay,
I
good.
recommend people grab this. I've enjoyed it. It is a great just beginning look at really key concepts of prophetic healing, contemplative faith, action, and just the heart of Howard Thurman. But so besides your beautiful book, what would you recommend? Maybe another one of yours.
Well, I think there's a couple things germane to what I was saying, and I have a chapter on Thurman in this book. Uh, a book called God Online,
Hmm.
a mystic's guide to the internet, how to
Okay.
be on the internet as a spiritual person. I'll plug two more books of mine, and I'll plug something that had just come out. One book
Okay.
called what's it called? Good Lord, you forget your books. It's Mystics. Uh, well, one coming out soon is a book on. I need to look my own books up. Mystics for Today, or something like that. It's about contemplative action. 12 Saints for Today is the book title behind. It's put out by
Okay.
Orbis Press. Mystics in Action. Mystics in
Yes.
Action. And another one that is coming out in January on St. Francis. I went on a pilgrimage to Assisi and was inspired. Francis of Assisi, From Privilege to Activism. And two books I'd recommend from Thurman. His own autobiography is a wonderful book, With Mind and Heart. With Mind and Heart.
Okay.
Then I love his book, Deep River. The Negro Spiritual speaks of life and death. It's a wonderful book about basically the songs of the slaves and how they sustained them in a difficult time. His book, The Growing Edge, is a wonderful book too.
Yeah.
He was very prolific, and he writes in short chapters, so you can, a little bit like the book there you've been studying, on the work of Christmas. Short chapters that you can just sort of eat like a Godiva chocolate and enjoy it for 15 minutes in the morning while you've done your morning prayers, and go on for the day a different person.
So good. Well, that is fantastic. We got a lot of great resources. I hope people caught that. I wrote them down, and we'll make sure to get those out to folks as well. Bruce, I can't thank you enough for returning a wild, crazy phone call from somebody in Colorado and taking time to be with us. And I know I am so appreciative of your thinking and writing and understanding of God, and am looking forward to reading more. I was telling a friend here how ticked off I was that I was in New England for 20 years and didn't know of your work or know of you. And I've spent so much time on the Cape, and was just completely
Well,
out of my
next
radar.
time, maybe next time, or
Next,
maybe I'll be back in Colorado. I still am due a visit to Buena Vista,
yes.
and maybe we'll go up to Loveland on the way.
That's right. I'm going to connect with Rebecca, and we're going to make sure that when you're in Colorado, we get you in both places. I think it'd be wonderful.
Well, and God bless you and your congregation. It looks like a lively place I'd love to attend.
Well, we would love to have you here sometime. So again, thank you, Bruce, for being with us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and being a part of this in our 12 Days of Christmas emphasis. I hope you're still listening to Christmas music. I know I am. I'm loving it. We're eating all kinds of celebratory food for 12 days, making
Yep.
sure that we really allow Christmas to be transformative in our lives and not just a momentary celebration. I want to thank Darren, who was behind the scenes, keeping us online and getting us ready to go, all that good stuff. So thanks, everybody, for being a part of this. We'll prepare the resource list. Debbie, thank you, absolutely. And we'll also put the links that Aisha provided. Bruce, thank you so very much. Everybody have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the Drop of Hope 12 Days of Christmas edition. Good night, everybody. Thank you again, Bruce.
We'll see you later.
Yes,
Bye.
we will. Bye-bye.